Japan's final gamble, surrender as the ultimate betrayal. As the sun rose on August 9, 1945, the Empire of Japan stood on the brink of total collapse. The devastating news that the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan had reached Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Emperor Hirohito early that morning. This unexpected blow added to the already overwhelming pressure from the Allied forces, who had been inching closer to the Japanese mainland with each passing day. For Suzuki and Hirohito, the time for decisive action had arrived. At 7:30 a.m., Suzuki made his way to the Imperial Palace, where he and Hirohito discussed Japan's dire situation. The two leaders agreed that the only viable option was to accept the Potsdam Declaration, which demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. Suzuki knew that this decision would be met with fierce resistance from the military, especially the hardliners who believed that surrender was a fate worse than death. However, he also understood that Hirohito's involvement would be crucial in breaking the deadlock. To avoid an outright rebellion within the government, Suzuki devised a strategy that would allow the emperor to take the final decision out of the hands of his advisors. He planned to hold meetings throughout the day without taking a formal vote, thereby postponing the decision until Hirohito could intervene and make the final call. This would be an unprecedented move, as the emperor traditionally remained above the fray of political decision-making. By the time the evening came, tensions were at their peak. Deep underground in Tokyo, in a humid room filled with the leaders of Japan, Suzuki took the bold step of asking Hirohito to decide the fate of the nation. The room fell silent as Hirohito, standing with the weight of centuries of tradition on his shoulders, slowly and deliberately voiced his agreement with the foreign minister's plan to surrender. He spoke of the immense suffering of the Japanese people and the futility of continuing the war, which could only lead to further destruction and bloodshed. Hirohito's speech was not only a declaration of surrender, but also a lifeline to those who had been desperately clinging to the hope of a final victory. His words offered a way out for the diehards in the military, who had vowed to fight to the last man. By taking on the responsibility of the decision, Hirohito allowed them to save face while also bringing the war to an end. As Hirohito left the room, a profound silence lingered among the men who had just heard their emperor speak. No one dared to object, and Suzuki's plan had succeeded. The meeting was adjourned, and the participants filed out into the quiet night of Tokyo, each man grappling with his own thoughts. However, the peace that had been achieved in the emperor's underground chamber did not extend to all corners of Tokyo. As the group reached the top of the steps leading out of the palace, General Yoshizumi, an aide to General Umezu, lost control. He lunged at Suzuki, shouting, "Are you happy now? Are you satisfied?" The outburst was a stark reminder of the deep divisions within Japan's leadership. General Anami quickly intervened, shielding the elderly statesman from the furious officer, and led him into the palace gardens. The beauty of the summer night stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Later that night, the cabinet reconvened at Suzuki's residence to finalize Japan's response to the Allied demand for surrender. Their primary concern was how to phrase the condition regarding the preservation of the emperor's status, a point that was non-negotiable for the Japanese leadership. The ministers debated through the night, aware that this message would soon be broadcast to the world, and that any misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. By 4 a.m., the cabinet members had reached an agreement on the wording, and the message was sent out over the airwaves. The decision to surrender was now public, but the internal struggles within Japan were far from over. As the news spread, opposition within the military began to grow, fueled by officers who could not accept the idea of surrender. General Anami, despite his public support for the emperor's decision, was deeply conflicted. He had spent the previous days in a state of exhaustion, his eyes heavy with fatigue and his mind burdened by the knowledge that the army had failed. Yet, at 9 a.m., he addressed the senior officers at the War Ministry, urging them to accept the emperor's decision. He emphasized the importance of maintaining order and unity within the army, warning that any individual actions could have disastrous consequences. Despite Anami's pleas, the discontent among the officers continued to simmer. In private conversations, some began to speak openly of rebellion. The idea that Japan could simply lay down its arms and accept defeat was anathema to many in the military, who had been indoctrinated with the belief that death was preferable to dishonor. One of the most vocal opponents of surrender was Colonel Masao Inaba, who composed a fiery speech urging the troops to continue resisting the enemy. Despite the lack of approval from General Anami, the speech was broadcast to Japanese forces overseas, further inflaming the situation. The message was clear. While the government might be willing to surrender, the military was not ready to give up the fight. As the situation in Tokyo grew more tense, a group of officers led by Colonel Masahiko Takeshita began to plot a coup. They believed that by seizing control of the government, they could prevent the surrender and continue the war. Takeshita, who was related by marriage to General Anami, felt confident that he could secure the support of key military leaders, including Anami himself. The conspirators met in secret, sketching out their plans in the dim light of air raid shelters beneath the War Ministry. Their ultimate goal was to reject the peace terms and to take the emperor into protective custody, isolating him from the influence of the appeasers like Suzuki and Togo. They also identified several key targets for assassination, including Baron Hironuma and other civilian leaders who supported the surrender. As the hours ticked by, the plotters grew more confident. They believed that with the right timing and support, they could change the course of history. The planned coup was set for midnight on August 13th, just hours before Japan was expected to officially surrender. However, not everyone within the military was on board with the plan. Colonel Tsukamoto, a member of the Kempeitai, Japanese secret police, had been transferred from Formosa to Tokyo just days earlier. Upon his arrival, he was puzzled by the sudden change in orders, but quickly found himself drawn into the center of the unfolding drama. Tsukamoto's old friend, Colonel Masataka Ida, who was deeply involved in the coup plot, approached him for help. Ida, who had once saved Tsukamoto's life, now asked for his assistance in overthrowing the government. Tsukamoto, however, was cautious. He agreed to cooperate only on two conditions: that the emperor himself did not oppose the plan, and that the entire army was unified in the effort. Ida was taken aback by Tsukamoto's hesitation. He had assumed that his friend would be fully committed to the cause, but Tsukamoto's response was guarded. Tsukamoto later reported the conspiracy to his superiors, ensuring that the plot would be closely monitored in the days leading up to the scheduled coup. Meanwhile, on the other side of Japan, events were taking a dark turn. In Fukuoka, 100 miles north of the smoldering remains of Nagasaki, a group of Japanese officers were preparing to commit a heinous act. In their custody were several captured American B-29 crewmen who had been shot down during bombing raids over Japan. On August 11th, these prisoners were taken to a remote field and executed in cold blood, a brutal act of vengeance for the atomic bombings that had devastated their country. As these atrocities were being carried out, preparations for a coup in Tokyo continued. The conspirators knew that time was running out, and they moved quickly to secure the support of key military figures. They planned to make their move just as the Allied response to Japan's surrender was expected to arrive. At 1 a.m. on August 12th, the long-awaited message from the Allies arrived in Tokyo. The Burns message, as it came to be known, outlined the terms of Japan's surrender, with the critical point being the preservation of the emperor's status. For the war faction, this was a bitter pill to swallow. They had hoped that by holding out, they could secure better terms, but the reality was that Japan had no leverage left. As the news spread through Tokyo, the conspirators at the War Ministry knew that their window of opportunity was closing. If they were to act, it had to be now. The atmosphere in the War Ministry was tense, with officers whispering in corridors about the possibility of rebellion. The plotters were confident that they